Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Texas Democratic and GOP primaries. We'll be taking a look at the gubernatorial races, lieutenant governor and attorney general, as well as a key House race for the Democrats. We'll also be looking at some historical Texas elections from 2020 and 2018 to kind of gauge primary turnout and really kind of guess where the general election results are going to wind up in the fall. We're also going to be taking a look at some of the Texas House districts a little later. I talked about the Texas House map before, but we'll really try and, based on these primary results, kind of see where exactly these races are really going to end up. So, first and foremost, we'll be taking a look at the governor's primary for Greg Abbott. Now, Greg Abbott was widely expected to win his primary. It was really a question of, for some Republicans, if they could get the race to a runoff like they did with the Attorney General election. That didn't end up happening. Greg Abbott won soundly with 66.5% of the vote, over 50%, 50 points over his nearest opponent, Allen West. We could take a look at some of the election polling for the governor primary, and it's really no surprise that Greg Abbott ended up winning by such a wide margin. All of the polls, all the reputable polls rather, except this this partners poll, which always had, for some reason, Allen West ahead. This was certainly an outlier firm. Taking these out of the equation, the polls basically had Abbott somewhere in the range of 60 to high 50s, low 60s. Some even had him 70s, 80s in the beginning. But the point is, it was very likely that Abbott was going to win by a pretty resounding margin. Now, of course, obviously only getting 66% as an incumbent governor in a state that's not really necessarily safe isn't the best thing in the world. However, Greg Abbott did have a lot of, well-funded opposition, although, his war chest was nearly $50 million, so he easily, he has a ton of money to fend off all of these challengers. Now, obviously, I think maybe if there was just one challenger against Greg Abbott, they would have fared better. Obviously, I didn't think there was any circumstance realistically that Greg Abbott could lose his primary. I mean, I made a video about it, that he was one of the vulnerable GOP incumbents, but that's really because I said he had somewhat of a, decent amount of opposition in, further right circles. And of course, a lot of these primary opponents tried to challenge Abbott on the right, on certain social issues, trying to get him to go farther on legislation, of course, with COVID restrictions, trying to go further than Abbott did in, getting rid of various mandates, more forcefully and things like that. So really the galvanizing issues for the GOP base. It didn't really pay off for Abbott, though. He ended up, again, winning by a pretty resounding margin. Now, interestingly enough, some of Abbott's largest support was actually in southern Texas along the Rio Grande. He got higher margins in these counties than he did in places like Dallas, Fort Worth, and northern Texas. So, these areas, the margins aren't necessarily as high for Abbott, but in the Rio Grande, they're particularly high, which, again, this is an important electorate to win in, because these are the majority Latino districts, counties. This area along the Rio Grande is going to be crucial to a GOP victory in 2022. Now, nobody expects the GOP to win the Hispanic vote, although maybe in Texas it could be possible just because the demographics are different in other states. But if they could get over 40%, which is what Greg Abbott got in 2018, they might even get higher because you're going to have a higher turnout among Republican Hispanics. Could be even 44%, something like that. So if those are the numbers the GOP is getting, then they're certainly in, excellent shape, obviously, for the midterms. And Greg Abbott is the guy that won last time. He, exceeded expectations compared to the other people on the ticket. If you go back to the 2018 election results, Greg Abbott got 55.8% of the vote when other people down ballot, such as Dan Patrick, the lieutenant governor, were getting 51.3%. Ken Paxton, who actually got the lowest percentage, even lower than Ted Cruz, 50.6% of the vote. So when you have somebody like Greg Abbott, a fairly strong Republican on the ticket, and again, still relatively popular, even despite all the things that happened last year with the power failures and things like that, it certainly is good that the GOP has somebody like him leading the ticket. Going down to the Democratic side, we have Beto O'Rourke. This wasn't shocking at all, winning by like 91% of the vote. Very unsurprising. There was really no other viable Democrat in the primary that had any chance of winning statewide. Beto's had wide name recognition for his 2018 Senate run against Ted Cruz, as well as his 2020 presidential run, which, both of those made him a very big name in Texas Democratic politics. So, this was obviously going to be a shoo-in for him. Now, going down to the Attorney General race, this is a really interesting one because, we have Ken Paxton only getting 42.7% of the vote. We have George P. Bush, Louis Gohmert, people like that, sort of big names on the ticket. Louis Gohmert is pretty big in the House, as being one of the more solidly conservative voices in the Republican caucus. And he did very well in his district, which is located in Northeast Texas. Ken Paxton did well most everywhere else, but, George P. Bush in most counties came in at a close second in some areas. His main, I guess, hope is that in the runoff, he can get the energy, get the turnout momentum to actually turn this race in his favor. Ken Paxton, again, still winning by, 19.9%. But, George P. Bush is a big name. He's a Bush, obviously. The Bush family is huge in the state of Texas. But Ken Paxton is an incumbent. And George P. Bush has taken a different approach than most other members of the Bush family, like George W. or Jeb. Whereas he's actually been, a kind of praised Trump, whereas these, the other members of the Bush family have kind of, criticized him every step of the way. So for the GOP base, that's pretty important. Loyalty to Trump is still a key factor in winning GOP primaries, even with Trump out of office for a little over a year now. So this result will be something to watch. I'm not too familiar, in fact, with the platforms that Ken Paxton and George P. Bush have. Obviously, George P. Bush is trying to get his breakthrough in politics, besides being agricultural commissioner. Now, he's another candidate that actually did fairly well in the 2018 results, despite every other down-ballot candidate besides Greg Abbott doing somewhat poorly. Again, we can go to, he's land commissioner. He ended up winning his race by about 10 points. Now, he did a little worse percentage-wise than Greg Abbott, but on overall margin, he was second best in the state. Every other candidate did worse besides him and Greg Abbott. So, of course, you could also make the argument that he's a very viable candidate. Now, of course, 2018 was a blue wave year. We're not going to see races this close in 2022. And if we do, that's very concerning for the GOP and very good for the Democrats, which would indicate that in other important states, they're doing a lot better than expected. But I don't expect to see this realistically in 2022. Obviously with Republicans having most likely a turnout advantage. And also, we'll take a look at the primary results now because the Republicans had almost 1 million more total votes in the primary than the Democrats did. We had the Texas gubernatorial primary for the GOP getting 1.9 million votes and Beto O'Rourke's getting 1.05 million votes. So, about 900,000 votes in the advantage for the Republicans. We can go back to the 2018 primary and take a look at those results and compare them. Ted Cruz getting 1.5 million votes to, Ted Cruz and all the other Republicans getting 1.5 million votes. Democrats, just about 1 million. So in terms of the amount of votes that are going into the Democratic primary this time around, they're almost the same as in 2018. However, for the Republican Party, there's about 400,000 more votes in the Republican primary. So that's good sign for Republican enthusiasm, even though this gubernatorial primary was not very competitive, in the grand scheme of things. Obviously, in certain circles, people were making this out to be a close race or a race where Greg Abbott could lose in an upset. Chances of that happening were very, 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 very low, if not impossible, based on, these results that we got last night. But ultimately, Republicans are in a good position in terms of their enthusiasm, in terms of their voter turnout that we can expect in the fall. They're energized to vote. Greg Abbott got more votes than all of the Democrats combined on the other side, which shows that there are still Republicans in the state of Texas who, might have voted for Joe Biden in 2020, might have voted for Democrats in 2018, that are starting to come back into the fold of the Republican Party. These people could have voted for independents too, and in the end are coming back to the Republican primary. Fold, rather. Looking at, again, some of these other races, statewide races, attorney general and lieutenant governor, I don't think these races are going to be that competitive come the general election. Maybe if Ken Paxton does become the nominee, because I know there's a lot of scandals and things going on with him, which is one of the reasons why he didn't really do so well in this primary. You know, most of the other Republicans on the ballot were getting 60, 66, 70% of the vote statewide. He only got 42.7 statewide, so it doesn't bode well for him. Now, there's one House race I want to talk about in particular, and that is let's go down to it, the 28th district, which is Henry Cuellar versus Jessica Cisneros. Now, this is an interesting race because Henry Cuellar is a very conservative Democrat. You know, conservative as in by Democratic standards. You know, mainstream standards, he's somewhat of a centrist, but in his South Texas district, he won by a margin of about 19 points. This was a district that only went to Joe Biden by around 3 percentage points. So he overperformed Joe Biden massively in his South Texas district. We can compare it to other South Texas districts like the 15th and the 34th, and you know, he performs the best by far in these other districts. Now, when we look at redistricting in particular, these districts are going to change considerably. You know, the 34th was a +5 for the Democrats, +4 for Texas 28th, and of course we had Texas 15th. Now, interestingly enough, the GOP actually destroyed their chances basically in one of the districts, the 34th. If you had left these districts the way they were, they all potentially could have been flips in a really good year for the GOP. Now, of course, that's a bit unrealistic, but it could have happened. So in some ways, the GOP gerrymander was a dummy mander in some sense because they gave the Democrats far more safe seats. Now, obviously, this was to prevent, obviously, the extent of a massive blue wave in the future. I get that. That would have, like, significantly cut down Democrats' gains. But, again, in a map where Democrats have gerrymandered so well in 2022 and effectively erased any GOP advantage, geographically speaking, in hindsight, from a GOP perspective, it was a bad idea to leave this many safe Democratic districts, and making districts like the 34th, for instance, the way it was, is something that could be pointed to as a dummy mander, I guess, from the GOP's perspective. Now, Henry Cuellar's district is a +7 Democratic district now, so it's a little bit safer than it was last time around, but some people think it could still be competitive in the general election based on his scandal. Again, like the FBI like raided his home and stuff like that. He's currently under investigation. So Jessica Cisneros wasn't necessarily primarying him because of that. She was primarying him from the left. You know, she brands herself as a very progressive character. And she almost upseated him outright. She came within 4 points of getting a majority of the vote, which would have staved off a runoff. Henry Cuellar did get the advantage. He won by less than 2 percentage points, which is really bad for an incumbent. He has to hope that in the runoff election, his fundraising apparatus will be able to outspend his progressive opponent. Either way, whichever Democrat wins is likely to go on to win the 2022 general election, unless, you know, there is a really strong Republican challenger. It is a D+7 district, so even in a red wave year, that still means that this district likely is going to vote 7 points left of the national average, which means if Republicans win the popular vote by 2, you would expect Democrats to win the vote here by around 5 points. So it by no means is as competitive as it was last time, but it's still there still is a chance on the general election level that it could be, you know, somewhat competitive anyway. You know, so going into 2022, you know, all of these statewide races in Texas are going to be something to watch, not because of how competitive they get, but kind of what the margins are, what we can expect, because the GOP really does have a chance with this midterm environment to really make inroads in the state of Texas again, a state that had been eroding GOP influence since 2016, when Donald Trump only won the state by 9 points. Of course, you have this disastrous result from a GOP's perspective, Ted Cruz barely beating a Democratic challenger in a statewide Senate race, not even a governor's race, a Senate race, by, you know, less than 3 percentage points. So, you know, I'll really be watching the margins for these Texas races come the midterms. Obviously, on midterm night, there's going to be a lot more races to watch than this one, but I will obviously check in on the state of Texas because I really want to see what the margins are going to be for these races. But I still think Greg Abbott probably will win the Texas gubernatorial race by over 10 points, as will the other down ballot candidates. Again, the primary is showing us that Republicans are heavily favored in all of these races. They have a higher turnout, higher enthusiasm. So I expect them ultimately to win all of these races by a pretty sound margin. And again, if I'm wrong, I'll obviously make a correction about that in the future. So anyway, guys, thank you all for watching this video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.